Hello, everyone. The South Carolina Office of Special Education Services, along with the Transition Alliance of South Carolina, present Using Evidence-Based Practices to Teach Organizational and Study Skills for Academics. This presentation is part of the Summer Transition Camp webinar series. The information and resources contained in this webinar are for general information purposes only and should not be construed as an endorsement by the South Carolina Department of Education.
Our presenter today is Dr. Deborah Holzberg. She is a clinical assistant professor and research associate at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Her research focuses on self-advocacy and academic skills relative to the transition of students with disabilities to post-secondary education. Dr. Holzberg is involved with the Council for Exceptional Children on a national and local level. Courses she teaches include Service Delivery Systems and Role Management, Universal Design for Learning, and Teaching Exceptional Children in the General Curriculum. In addition to teaching courses, Dr. Holzberg is a research associate with Beyond Academics, a 4-year comprehensive transition program for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities and autism spectrum disorder.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I'm Debbie Holzberg, and I'm here to teach you all about strategies and skills for organization for students with disabilities. So I just want to go over a brief agenda with you. We'll talk about teaching skills and strategies, and that would be the methods to teach the strategies and skills that we'll go over. Then we'll go into academic skills and strategies for students preparing to transition with some examples. And then we'll also go into organizational, meaning the material and the temporal or time skills and strategies for students preparing to transition. And we'll provide some examples of skills and strategies for you. We have 3 basic objectives or goals. We'll provide an overview of teaching skills and strategies, the overview of teaching academic skills, and an overview and example of organizational practices, like I said, time and materials. So let's dive right into teaching skills and strategies using self-regulated strategy development, which is an evidence-based practice. SRSD is a framework that is used to explicitly teach learning strategies to students. This is where teachers will provide explicit instruction on self-regulation strategies. So it's something that's used with self-monitoring or self-instruction, goal setting, and self-reinforcement. So this is what you want to do when you teach a strategy to students to ensure they're using it and they're using it with fidelity. The procedures involved in using SRSD are to develop background knowledge first. So we want to determine the skills students need for a target strategy. So for example, if the target strategy is using a graphic organizer, what skills do students need to be able to demonstrate a target behavior or the target strategy? Next, you want to assess if the student has those prerequisite skills. Then you want to facilitate the development of the prerequisite skills if they don't already have them in order to learn the target strategy. So you're going to discuss the target strategy with a student. Let's go back to a graphic organizer, and let's say we're using a Venn diagram. You're going to explain what a Venn diagram is to students. Most middle and high school students will already know what a Venn diagram is, but we'll re-explain what the purpose is. They may know what it is, but they may not understand exactly why it's used and how it's used. You'll teach them when it's appropriate to use it, which would be if you're going to compare and contrast something. You're going to remind students that their effort and energy that they put into it is really important in the process. Then you'll teach students that they can use the target strategy in multiple classes, so that they can generalize that strategy to other applications. For example, I taught high school history for years, and I would teach a strategy to my students, but I would always tell them, remember, you can use this in your other classes like science and English and math, depending on what you're covering. So we want to make sure that they know that it's not in a silo or that it's in isolation, that it's something that can be used in multiple classes in multiple settings. Next, you want to explain self-monitoring and teach students to self-monitor their use of the strategy, which is really a metacognitive process. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. You want to model the target strategy. So using think aloud, to teach students to think through the process of using the strategy. You want to demonstrate the steps in the target strategy and explain why the steps are important. We'll discuss this model example a little bit more when I talk about explicit instruction in a few minutes. You want to teach students to memorize the target strategy. So, you know, if we go back to using graphic organizers, you are going to teach them to memorize what they need to do first. So what do they need to do first? Identify what goes in one side of the Venn diagram, what goes, then figure out what would be the overlap, and then what goes in the other side or the right side. And you want to encourage students to learn those steps fluently. Sometimes you can use a mnemonic for this, and that's something we'll talk about again in a little bit. So just take notes and write down any questions. You want to support the use of the strategy for students. Offer opportunities to use the strategy, so build in opportunities in your lesson planning so students can learn to practice the strategy and use it with proficiency. In the beginning, you're going to guide them, use positive reinforcement. Behavior-specific positive reinforcement is really important. 95% of teachers offer positive praise, but they're not specific in what the student is doing correctly, so the student may not know what to replicate in that behavior or what to do again. Then eventually you want to fade the support as the student gains proficiency in using the target strategy. Remember, though, that you want to remind or prompt the students to use the strategy in other settings. Again, that goes back to teaching generalization. Next, you want to establish independent practice. So if it's needed, you want to monitor and support the students' performance. And again, I go back to the idea of creating lesson plans that allow students to practice and maintain and generalize the new strategy in different settings and across tasks. So here's a little graphic to break down what we just discussed in supporting the use of self-regulated strategy development. Next, we're going to move on to our second goal, which will talk about academic skills and strategies. First, we're going to talk about metacognitive strategies. So I've broken out the word for meta, which equals great, and cog is think or to think. So technically it means great thinking, but really when we talk about metacognition, we talk about thinking about thinking. It's that kind of internal dialogue that we have when we're checking ourselves or when we're doing something, engaging in a task. Their strategic thought process, and they play a key role in knowing when and why to use a particular strategy. So this is really important because some students will automatically know to do this. They'll know, they'll do what we call verbally mediating a task. So they'll sort of sub-vocalize and describe what they're doing or why they're doing it, or they'll talk themselves through it like, this doesn't look right, or wait a minute, this can't be correct, or it doesn't make sense. Sometimes with students with disabilities, we have to explicitly teach them to do this so that they learn to be aware and not just fly over a mistake that they've made, particularly if we think about like reading and when they make a miscue when they're reading and then they lose the meaning of the word. And this also goes to like fix-it strategies. Students who are proficient in metacognitive thinking, they have really good fix-it strategies. They'll know when they've made a mistake and then they'll go back and automatically fix it. It's an internal process for them. So for our kiddos with disabilities, a lot of times we just want to explicitly teach that. So you want to teach students to activate their prior knowledge so that they start thinking about, what do I know? What do I know about this? What have I learned about this? Usually, often, we hope teachers are doing that when they start a new concept or a new topic. But you also want to make sure that students know to do that on their own. You want them to ask self-reflective questions. Am I understanding this? Does this make sense to me? You want them to be aware of their strengths and weaknesses. So I'm not really great at math, or I'll take a personal example. I tend to reverse numbers. So I have to be really careful with my numbers. This is a weakness. So if I'm looking at numbers, I need to say to myself, oh, I always flip numbers. Is this correct? Teaching them to think aloud, which is that sub-vocalization that I mentioned a little bit earlier as they process through or they mediate a task. Another great example is to just do a brain dump. What do they know about something? They can do that in the form of a mind mapping, or they can make a list, whatever's comfortable for them. Developing a plan before engaging in a task. What do I need to do? What's it going to take for me to get this task done? Okay. Self-monitoring the use of fix-up strategies. Am I asking myself, does this make sense? And then we want them to reflect on their thinking after completing a task. So they can be reflective about it and see what worked and what might not have worked, or where could they have been more metacognitive. So metacognition involves tapping into their schema or their existing conceptual framework for how they know the world. And this little graphic will show you some of the things that somebody who is using metacognitive strategies will engage in as they're going through the process. Along with that, we want to make sure that we're teaching using explicit instruction. So this is really where the rubber hits the road in our instruction. This is the details. These are the details. Explicit instruction is well researched. It's a highly effective strategy. We're going to focus on the most relevant content. It's really important when we're teaching to pick out, what do they really need to know? What's really important? What's the big idea? Okay, we want to focus on the skills, the strategies, the vocabulary, and the key concepts. It's important to teach students how to learn, not just to memorize a bunch of facts and information, but how they can learn and what their process is. So when you're designing instruction and using these strategies, you want to intentionally sequence your content. So prerequisite skills first. What do they need to be able to do this strategy? Easier skills before harder skills. High frequency before low frequency. So if you look at it this way, that the teacher responsibility is the upside down triangle, it starts with the teacher modeling, which is the I do part of it, and the student's responsibility is very little because they are the receivers of the information. When we move into the we do or the guided practice, we're going to share that responsibility. And as we move them to independent practice or the you do, we're going to be there to support and scaffold and make sure that they're doing it correctly and provide reinforcement. But really, it's on them to make sure that they're using the strategy correctly. Okay. So lessons should be focused on topic and designed to maximize instructional time. They're going to rely on routine. So opening, like reviewing the information, previewing, activating prior knowledge. You're going to have the body, and you're going to have the closing of the lesson, which is going to be the review. So before we introduce a new topic, we want to provide a direct explanation, but we also want to make sure that we're tapping into their schema or their prior knowledge and connecting it with new information. This is Wally, and this is what I use when I teach about schema and why it's so important in tapping into it for my students. And I ask my students what Wally is, and I listen to them as they engage in a discussion and go through their schema as to explaining why Wally is what Wally is. And the reality is Wally is just something I drew for this exact reason, that Wally really can't be fit into a specific category because Wally is so many of so many different things and could be so many different things. But it really gets them understanding why schema is so important and why tapping into it helps them relate to new material. You want to use a hook, clarify the learning set. So the strategies would be like metacognitive, such as front loading. So front loading is really helping students before they get to the information, before you're going to teach it, is giving it to them in advance or giving them a preview. Creating mental images. So I mentioned that I used to teach, I taught high school and I taught high school history. I also taught middle school history. So I would say to my students when we were talking about ancient civilizations, close your eyes. What do you see? What would life be like back then? What were you doing? So we want to try and activate their imagination, their prior knowledge, and what they've learned in the past, what they've seen, and what their experiences are. Some of the activities we can do are to provide cues. We can do a KWL chart. We can do guided imagery, and we can do anticipation guides, which were some of the things I just described above. When we demonstrate or we do the I do, the teacher engages students through questioning, modeling, and strategies. So you're teaching a new skill, and you're asking students relevant questions. If you're teaching morphemic analysis, which is basically the breaking down of stems and roots, what do you know? Where have you seen these before? Then you go through some examples. The students are going to monitor their thinking, which is a metacognitive process, and this teacher is going to monitor and assess student learning. This will allow immediate feedback and clarification. So things like note-taking, Cornell notes or graphic organizers are great strategies, and activities would be things like think alouds, again, guided imagery, think, pair, share, KWL, and a BDA chart, which is before, during, after, I'm sure. Okay. We move to the we do. We're going to provide support with a gradual release as students gain competency, and you're going to use data to inform their competency. The teacher's going to elicit frequent responses, so lots of participation, monitor for conceptual clarity. You may use group work for we do. It's a great way to do it, and that way that peer-assisted learning, they can help themselves. We're going to use student work samples to monitor progress and performance to make sure that we're capturing the data. So students, like I said, can work alone, they can work in pairs or small groups, and activities for guided practice could be story mapping or mind mapping, turn and talk, visualize or imagine, analyze and reflect, response cards, or choral response, are just a few of the examples. Moving to you do, that can be done with homework or classwork individually. Students are going to engage in problem solving. They might lead discussions. They'll use rubrics to improve their work. Another great metacognitive strategy is teaching students to use the rubric. Am I addressing the issues or the points on the rubric? Teachers, again, will use the results to inform instruction and evaluate student learning. So the you do is done when the teacher is sure that students have the prerequisite proficiency. You have to know that they're ready for it, that they have the supports and the experience to be able to do it on their own through the we do and the I do sections, or the phases of the practice. And again, examples could be homework, classwork, or reflections. Those are just a few examples. So moving on to academic skills. Teaching vocabulary, the importance of it cannot be understated. We cannot assume that students know what words mean. I work with a lot of students on preparing for the ACT and SAT, and one of my biggest observations is they lack the skills and strategies in taking tests and in breaking down vocabulary and in really getting to what things mean. So there are two types of vocabulary strategies: word specific, where students learn each word separately, or generative, where they figure out the meaning of the words. We're going to focus on generative, and specifically we're going to focus on morphemic analysis. There's a really strong evidence base to support the use of morphemic analysis, and it can be generalized into a lot of different settings and situations, and I'll give you some examples. So in generative strategies, particularly in morphemic analysis, students learn the meaning of high-frequency prefixes, suffixes, and roots. So the Latin and Greek roots. And then they learn the meaning of roots with large word families. They're going to apply these meanings when they encounter a new word. So it is basically a strategy to help students predict meaning. And you can see the text here has the guy standing over a dictionary, and he says, pork, you, pine, as it's phonetically spelled out there, as it's spelled out there for him. And his answer is, when you long for pork, you pine for pork. So just a little funny to break up our monotony here, and that part can be deleted. So this is a little FYI for you. Printed school English through 8th grade contains around 88,500 distinct word families. And one example would be persecute, persecution, persecutor, and persecuting. So we have to teach them to make those connections. Oftentimes, students will not, they'll learn a word in one form like persecute, but they won't connect it to the other forms. So they learn the word in isolation without making those connections. Stems and roots and instruction in that really helps them make those connections. So it is a generative strategy, morphemic analysis. It enables students to figure out the meanings of new words, and you would teach it using explicit instruction and the steps and stages as described before. So you want to first teach them the meaning of morpheme and syllable, because those are two key vocabulary words. So the morpheme is the smartest part of a word with meaning, and a syllable is the part of the word that centers on the vowel sound. It has no meaning. So morphemes versus syllables, take unladylike. Syllables would be unladylike. If you did the clap it out thing, it would be unladylike. But the morphemes are unlady and like. So when we look at morphemes, we look at prefixes, roots, and suffixes. So if we take the word prediction, we have pre, which means before, dict is speak, and shun is like doing something or the action. So we have prediction, we can break it out that way. I look at morphemic analysis as basic math. So it's like teaching basic math facts. If we teach stems and roots, we give students access to a huge amount of vocabulary that they did not have access before, or they did not have access to before. So if we use a DISSECT strategy, we discover the sounds and context. So look at the letters and try and sound out the word. Skip it if it's too difficult and try and use context cues to get the meaning. You isolate the beginning, see if the first several letters can be isolated to create a phoneme or a prefix that can be pronounced, like pre. Separate the ending, see if the ending forms a phoneme or a suffix. Say the stem. If there's a stem, isolate it from its prefix or suffix. So if you look at dyslexia, dis is bad, lex is word, and ia is forming the names of. So then we know bad words. So that's not literally the definition, but if you take that in context of the sentence, you're going to get the meaning. You examine the stem for meaning and check with someone. May ask for help with pronunciation. I remember I had a student who knew how to use the word melancholy, but when she read it, she read melancholy. Well, melancholy may not sound like melancholy, and therefore she may lose the meaning. And then you try the dictionary or ask Alexa or Siri or even a friend they know. So moving on to graphic organizers, another evidence-based practice. Graphic organizers are visual displays that arrange words using boxes, cells, arrows, or other visual cues. Use explicit instruction again to teach students how to use graphic organizers. Provide examples of completed graphic organizers for students to understand how they're used. One thing that I did with my students, particularly in high school, is taught them to outline. But I taught them to outline using a basic graphic organizer that I created, which was really an outline template. And it was done sort of like a closed reading activity or guided notes, where they had some of the information but didn't have all of the information. So here are a couple of different graphic organizers. There are tons and tons out there. In my situation, when I was teaching, for the most part, I used to I mostly made them on my own. But that was a while ago when I was in the classroom teaching history, and now there's all kinds of graphic organizers available. So the first one was for literature or for reading, and then I put in two, one for the scientific method and one for timeline. That visualization for history is really helpful for a lot of students, particularly because oftentimes history books present the information in region or in geographically rather than temporally. So they don't tell you everything that was going on around the world in one time. they tell you what was going on in that region, and then they run through from, you know, maybe they do it in ancient history, and then they'll go to, you know, maybe the Middle Ages time, and then maybe recent history. But the countries or the regions or the areas are not all tied together. So if you do a timeline like that, it really helps students connect that what was happening in one part of the world, other things were happening in other parts of the world. So we'll move on to mnemonics. This is a personal favorite of mine. There is a robust evidence base for the use of mnemonics. A mnemonic is a memory aider device. It helps chunk information. So we know that short-term memory can really hold about 7 to 10 items, plus or minus, 7 items plus or minus 3. It's kind of like a shelf, and there's limited space, and once we put something else on, whatever was at the edge of the shelf gets knocked off. Mnemonics should make sense. They should not be too silly or too far removed, and they reduce the demands on working memory. So this is one that my students and I made up when I was teaching the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, and we did a kind boy hopped across Central Park. So a kind was Akkadian, boy was Babylonian, hopped was Hittite, across was Assyrian, and we remembered it because across had 2 S's and Assyrian has 2 S's. Central was Chaldean and Park was Persian. Here are a couple of other ones. This is when I was teaching India, ancient India. So I taught them that the Bhagavad Gita is inside the Mahabharata. And then we were teaching Brahma was the creator. So bring cookies. So if you read it through, bring cookies that are very pretty someday. Okay, so it was Brahma was the creator, Vishnu was the preserver, and Siva was the destroyer. Then I taught them that Dharma was their duty, and Moksha was moving on with the MO. And then I also taught them that if you want good karma, do your Dharma. So we had all kinds of strategies to remember the information, which meant that they didn't have to really rely on their short-term memory because they had this information chunked in a way that was accessible to them. Here's the use of stems and roots in the mnemonics. Mesopotamia is land between the rivers. So meso equals middle. So actually it would be a little bit lower that you'll see this example. So Exodus was Moses's journey out of Egypt after the Pharaoh freed the Jews. Exo is out. So Exodus is exit out of us. It sounds similar. So those are just a few examples of how you can use mnemonics. We all know maybe Roy G. Biv for the spectrum, the color spectrum. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally for order of operations. These have a lot of, like I said, a lot of demonstrated efficacy or effectiveness with students in helping them retain information. So moving on to note-taking. I think this is an area where students really, really struggle with that and with highlighting when they're reading. They really don't know when to write down. So what is important enough for me to write down? And I used to tell my students when they were highlighting, think of the ink in their highlighter as a limited resource and to really only use it when they needed to use it. So it's kind of the same with note-taking, but that's really hard because it demands them listening to what's being said, understanding what's being said, and then making the determination of whether or not it's important. At that point, for a lot of kids, it's easier to just write it all down, okay? So we want to teach them certain cues, like pay attention to dates, to names, events. I used to teach my students to listen to my voice and look at my facial expressions. So if we're teaching online, that might be a little bit harder, but if we're particularly, if we emote or we use our emotions when we're teaching, we can convey that information maybe a little bit with a little more emphasis than if we were teaching face to face, where we would have the benefit of maybe using our hands or moving around or things, pointing to things that we can't necessarily do if we're teaching in a remote situation. You want to provide graphic organizers to help support their note-taking. That's a really important tool for students to be able to use, so guided notes, and you can scaffold that and teach it using explicit instruction. Teach different methods. There's not one method for any student that necessarily works the best. When you can provide notes for students, particularly for our students with disabilities. I always provided my PowerPoint slides to my students with a section to take notes, but I used to tell them that I want them to make notes and not take notes. I think sometimes note-taking becomes a little bit of a power struggle where we want to know that the students are engaged in listening. And so by them taking notes, that looks to us like they're engaged and listening. But as somebody with ADHD, I can tell you that I took notes for many, many years and just wrote down what I was hearing, but wasn't really absorbing or paying attention to it. So we need to be mindful of that. Is it better to provide them with the notes and have them highlight or circle so they're not bogged down with the graphomotor task or even the typing task of taking notes? We want to promote the use of assistive technology. So things like LiveScribe Pen. There's also an amazing program or an app called Sonocent, and they have another version of it called Glean, which audio records and allows the student to tag spots in the note, sort of like a LiveScribe Pen does, but on their computer, and they can type notes and tag things. It's quite amazing. It's quite an amazing technology and very helpful. So I mentioned outlining a little bit earlier. So here's just an example of a traditional format. What I would do is I would put number 1 and I'd give them the heading, and then I would put like the A and then the numbers below. And I might fill in a couple of those, which would help them know what they were looking for in their notes. Like if I've gotten to 3, which says develop natural style, then I should have 2 before that. So if I fill in, if I give them 3, then they know they have to have 2 things before 3 that would be important. This is very metacognitive and really helps them pick out what's important. And what I would do is I would take their example, I would get a volunteer and I would take their notes and I would put it next to mine. And we would do a side-by-side comparison, and then I would have them justify why they picked something or explain why I might have picked something. And sometimes we would take something out of mine and add what they did. It's just a really great learning exercise. They don't like doing it at all because it's tedious. It requires a lot of cognitive effort. But I can't tell you the number of students I've had come back to me and say, thank you so much, because when I went to college, it was a huge, huge help. So there's also Cornell Notes, which a couple of examples of Cornell Notes are here, but basically you put some key points or main ideas in the left side and then the details in the right side, and then you summarize. Mind mapping is great. There's actually like sketchnoting. That's something that I'm learning myself right now, is to draw the little icons. But for some students who are visual, it's extremely, extremely helpful. It doesn't really matter how they represent the information, as long as they understand what it means and they can take the meaning from it. That's really what matters. So we go back to graphic organizers as a tool for note-taking. And this can be really, really helpful as well, because it helps students break down the information. If I were doing this in the beginning with students, I would fill in maybe the headings and a couple of key points, and then let them fill in the rest so that they learn to pick out what is important or where the salient information is. So we're going to go to goal 3, which is our organizational skills. And it's important to note that there are a couple of different types of organization. One is materials, so the physical materials that we have, and the other is temporal, which would be planning and scheduling. For students with disabilities, poor organizational skills or faulty organizational skills are often the result of executive function weakness. So it's really important that we teach them these skills, and that, again, we teach that generalization. Typically, teaching it using explicit instruction is my go-to. but it does have to be explicitly taught. And if we talk about materials, so a lot of our students have A days and B days, and that can result in materials not coming to school when they're supposed to, or all of the materials, they just keep everything in their backpack, so they're walking around with 50 pounds of books and materials on their backs, which really we know is not very good for them. So one thing that can be done is a discrete, I mean, if they're in middle school and high school, they don't want a little checklist hanging off their backpack, but something like a luggage tag that can be tucked in to check off what they need. And that again is going to be metacognitive, and it's going to be self-monitoring. Do I have what I need to get through my day today? If it's a math day, do I have a calculator if I need a calculator? Do I have graph paper if I need graph paper? Different checklists, obviously, if the student has A days and B days. The other possibility is either 2 backpacks, which may or may not be possible, or an inner bag, like a big Ziploc bag. Everything for the A days goes in one, everything for the B days goes in the other, and then the student just pulls it out and drops in the correct A day or B day. A printed schedule too is obviously really, really helpful. Another thing that I am a big proponent of is using the same color folders. It may seem silly, but I wish we would do this in elementary school. I wish all of the teachers could get together and come to a consensus that every math folder is going to be red, or whatever they pick. I pick science for green because science and green and the environment. I pick history for blue because I think of a globe and there's more blue on the globe, and yellow for English. But if we use the same colors year to year, then they don't really have to think about it. It just becomes automatic for them. I'll just pull this one because I know I need math. It's a simple strategy, but something that's really effective. Okay, moving to temporal skills or time management. And I like to think of it as self-management because time doesn't change. It's what we do within our time. It's how we manage ourselves within the time that we have. This tends to be a really big issue for many students with disabilities, and it can involve the lack of awareness of passing time, the lack of self-awareness of the length of time to complete a task, and the lack of awareness of the required steps. So let's go back to the first one. How do we make students aware of how much time is passing? We can use simple strategies to do that with things that aren't even school related. But for example, if you listen to music while you're doing a task, maybe making lunch or whatever the task may be, how many songs does it take? If I've gotten to 3 songs, then I know I've been there too long. Okay, so that's just one way to help that. I mean, you can use timers and all those things as well. Obviously, those are great strategies, but you want to meet them where they are. So I like to use the example of songs. Most songs have a certain average. I mean, if they're listening to a really long song, maybe that's not the best way to do it. But in general, they have, they're a couple minutes, 2-3 minutes long. If we take the length of time to complete a task, okay, that's really talking about how long will this take me? I have an assignment. How long is it going to take me to complete this assignment? I would venture to say that students underestimate that by a good, they're usually it takes them twice the amount of time that they think it's going to take them. So I always tell them to estimate and then double. And if they have extra time, that's a bonus. So we want to get them used to measuring. So what I used to do is I had them fill out a sheet. I think this task will take me this long. And then I would have them put the amount of time that it really took them. We want to develop the awareness of the passing of time and of their ability to estimate. It's kind of like the same thing with a lot of kids. Maybe there are 2 extremes to this, but how did you do on a test? I have one of my children used to say, oh, I think I did really well on that test. And then turned out he didn't really do as well because his ability to be self-aware wasn't as good as it needed to be. Or you get the kid who doesn't have the confidence and they say they didn't do well. So again, it's that self-awareness. And the lack of awareness to complete the task. What do I need to do in order to complete it? This is why so many parents have to run out at 9 o'clock to pick up supplies for a project, because the kiddo didn't say, I need this or I need that. So what are the required steps? If I'm going to do this project or this assignment, what do I have to do? If I'm going to do a book report, I better read the book. How long is it going to take me to read the book? And those things we sort of, we may assume that students possess that information or those skills, but a lot of times they don't. Then they go into panic mode. I didn't realize it was going to take this long. I'm never going to be able to get it done. They shut down, and that's the end of it. Then we get nothing generated from them. When if we had taught them that skill and scaffolded it for them, then we might be able to help them get to the end result. So we want to explicitly teach time management using electronic calendars or paper calendars, or I personally use both. We want to do it using backward planning and chunking steps of an assignment. So I'm going to explain a project that I used to do with my students that really drove this point home. So I taught high school students. I taught history for a number of years, and then I was asked to teach a transition course for students who are preparing to go to college. One of the biggest issues with students preparing to go to college is now their time isn't structured. So they have all these gaps of time where they don't really know how to manage that time very well often. And so, and then if they're not really self-aware, they get lost in a task, and we know how that ends. So what I did with my students is I got them 4 freshman level syllabi. And basically I picked like 3 core classes that I knew they would have to take, and I picked a class that was from an area of interest they had expressed. So if they were interested in psychology, I got them a syllabus from Psych 101 class. And I had them go through all 4 syllabi and create a semester-long calendar, down to exercise, down to spending time with friends, with pretty much almost every contingency I could come up with, except a pandemic, but almost every contingency I could come up with to help them realize where they were allocating their time. So if they had a class at 11 o'clock, and then they had a class at 3 o'clock, how are they spending the couple of hours in between those classes? Or if they had a really early morning class and then a late afternoon class, what were they doing in between to maximize their time and to make sure that they understood how time was passing? Backward planning. So in this assignment, they had to put every assignment on the syllabus, on all the syllabi, into their calendar. So I had them use Google Calendar because I wanted them to be I wanted them to have proficiency using an electronic calendar so they could sync it up to their phones. So every assignment, whether it was a reading assignment, whatever it was, if it was a project or a test, then I had them plan study time. So if I have a test at this time, in 2 weeks, how much am I going to study every day? Do I need to go to the learning center? Do I need to go to the writing center for a paper? I had them put everything in. Another task that I gave them that they really didn't like, but something that really showed them where their time was going, including, things like chunking the steps of assignment. First, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do that. The goal really was to make sure that they weren't panicking the night before something was due. And then I tell them the story of how I wrote a paper the night before it was due, and my computer locked, and this was long before we had Word or anything like that. And I didn't have an outline or any of the things that good students and proficient students do. And I ended up having to rewrite the entire paper pretty much off the top of my head. So needless to say, it wasn't a very good result. So we want to explicitly teach time management. We want to teach goal setting using SMART goals, which you may be familiar with using from IEP goals, but they would be SMART, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. We want to teach them to prioritize. If this is due on Tuesday, what do I have due Monday? Can I put something off? How can I juggle it to make sure that everything's getting done in time? Creating to-do or task lists, and then have them check it off as they complete items. So backward planning, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more because I think it's really important. And it works. I use backward planning in my instructional design, and I teach students to use backward planning in their work. So you want to look at the end goals to help them consider the steps and identify potential barriers to completion. According to Park, Liu, and Hedgecock, backward planning not only led to greater motivation, higher goal expectancy, and less time pressure, but also resulted in better goal-relevant performance. It works. So it also resulted in increased student motivation and improved grades. So you begin with the due date and the end goal. Then you break the task assignment down into parts. So you chunk it. Consider the prerequisite tasks that have to be completed in order to move forward. What do they have to do first? If it's a book report, they can't move forward unless they've read the book. Think about materials that might be necessary. So this goes back to those late night runs for supplies. If they have to create a poster presentation for something and it's not digital, what materials do they need? And how do they get those materials? And what other obligations or activities do they have that might be a barrier that they might not have counted for? If they have sports practice or tutoring, after school tutoring, then how does that get into their planning of their time? So here's kind of an abbreviated example. So let's say the class is English and the due date is September 28th, okay? And it's a book project or a report. So the plan is first thing they have to do is create an outline or complete a graphic organizer about the book. They estimate it's going to take 2 hours and they want to have that done by September 10th. Next, they want to have a rough draft based on their outline or their graphic organizer. They think that might take them 6 hours and they're going to have that done by September 17th. And then you would go on and add maybe a revision so that they have time for teacher feedback and peer editing. And then some teachers will allow students to submit work early and they'll preview it and say, you know, you're on the right track or this looks good. So you want to make sure that they leave plenty of time for that. So some of the big takeaways I hope that you've gotten from this is there are numerous evidence and research-based strategies to help students better access content. Students often must be explicitly taught strategies, and they have to be taught to generalize those strategies and skills. SRSD and explicit instruction facilitate the acquisition of the strategies and skills for students with disabilities. So I didn't talk a lot about moving it online, and that seems to be our reality. So let's talk about some of the things that we can do about moving it online, about moving instruction online, if that's where we end up for any length of time. We know that students with disabilities benefit from a recursive approach to teaching, which can be more challenging in an online platform. When I teach my students about recursive teaching, I walk forward 2 steps and then I take a step back, and then I walk forward 2 steps and I take a step back. And I say we're gaining, but we have to go back and review and reinforce. So some of the tips to mitigate those challenges would be video record lessons so students can play them back and re-listen to the lesson. This really allows them to do this at their own pace and to go back and get clarification if they've missed something. If you use PowerPoint, you can use the always use subtitles feature under slideshow, and it will caption your slides as you record the information and present it. So it's better if you're recording because it will capture everything, but it will overwrite if you're doing it in real time and can't be rewound. I hope that makes sense. Provide explicit written instructions and examples for students. This is really important, and that goes down to basically task analyzing your instructions, things that they could get from being face-to-face with you or from questions that might be asked. They're not going to get in an online, or they may not get in an online setting. So we want to make sure that we've given them really explicit instructions, that we've given them examples to help guide their work and ensure that they're giving us the best quality product. Use breakout rooms for students to engage in small group work. This works really well for We Do activities. Give them blank templates for graphic organizers on your LMS. Now, you know, maybe this is something that you already do, but upload the tools that you want them to have. They're not going to be getting handouts. They're not going to, you know, in class, They can fill these out on a computer if they have access to a computer, but make sure that they have the materials to help them be successful. Providing detailed rubrics and teaching students to use those rubrics is huge. I teach college students. A lot of my college students don't use the rubrics. I'm constantly saying, if you look at the rubric and you go through and check everything off that's on there, you're gonna earn all your points. So we want to make sure that we're sharing our expectations with them and then teaching them and reinforcing the use of those rubrics. Allow flexibility in the way they represent their knowledge or their understanding. And this is just a basic UDL thing, but and not necessarily even an online thing. This is something I do in my classes, but allow them to represent what they know in the ways where they can best represent it. I had my students in one of my classes, they had to write up their service learning experience, and I allowed them to depict it any way they wanted. The paper had a certain page number limit because I couldn't read, basically dissertations on it. I had a student who did an infographic. One of my students chose to do an infographic. What she produced was so far above and beyond what anybody could have produced in a paper. She did it in her terms and still conveyed the information. And that's really, really important for students to have that ownership and helps with their motivation. And hold regular office hours for students so they can clarify questions or discuss concerns. I think that's a really, really important issue, that missing that face-to-face contact can be a big barrier for students. This is access to a Padlet I've created with many, many, many resources, some that I've talked about, but lots and lots of resources. Please feel free to visit it and look around, and there may very well be things that can help you in your teaching as you move forward. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and have a great school year. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
This will conclude today's webinar. For more resources, be sure to visit the Transition Alliance of South Carolina's webpage at transitionalliancesc.org. Thank you, and have a great day.